Hey guys. This is part 2 of What If Naruto and Sasuke became friends a few years early. Hit like and subscribe if you like this one, and also please check the author in the description. Let's start.
We are paid, that's all. We are God.
Chapter 5. Remind me again why we're chasing a cat halfway across Konoha. Mostly? Because I told you to. That seems like a really crappy reason in hindsight, sensei. I don't need your lip, and remember, you three wanted to do code names, so we're doing code names. Your Blossom Dance, I'm Silver Fang. You three wanted to do code names seems unfair, given that both Sakura and I protested the idea. Quiet, Dark Shadow. What are you? Wait, is that my code name? I've got her. Mission Compel Ow. What the she's scratching me. Ugh. This is Blossom Dance, I'm en route to Orange Julius, over. Air. This is Sasuke, I'm. This is Silver Fang, please use your code name in official communications, over. This is Dark Shadow, I'm rendezvousing with Orange Julius and Blossom Dance, over. Better, over. I hate you, over. Kakashi laughed, listening in as his students struggled to capture Tora, who was somehow both still alive after his own team had successfully brought her back into her master's arms over 10 years ago, and from the sound of his team's screams, much better at defending herself. But how the hell is she alive? Kakashi thought, listening as his team screamed out attack names, a fireball jutsu among them, which, against any normal cat, may have been overkill. He knew Tora, however, and he knew it was not overkill. How the hell did it still dodge that? We can do this. Focus, team. Yeah, okay. Sasuke spoke up quietly, missing out on the overly hyped atmosphere of the other two. He probably saw this for what it was, more than they'd bargained for. Kakashi snorted. He felt he could see the grimacing face of Team 7's resident introvert, despite being a kilometer or so away. Still, it was more fun to stir the pot, wasn't it? More excitement, Dark Shadow. He spoke up, feigning utter seriousness. Tora is a Jonin rank foe, you'll need to fight with all your strength to defeat her. You suck, ah! Sasuke had made to speak, but was interrupted by something, presumably Tora, and had the wind knocked out of him. Alright. I've had enough. Multi-shadow clone jutsu. There was a sound akin to several hundred small explosions going off, and then the sound of several hundred Narutos shouting out, "I've got you." They seemed to have it covered, Kakashi thought. Naruto was very happy, standing in front of an older woman as she cradled Tora into her bosom, strangling the evil cat in it. He didn't even hold back the slightly sadistic smile that grew on his face as the cat looked at him, seemingly desperate for aid. Long live the king, Tora. He spoke softly. The cat narrowed its eyes, and if Naruto wasn't aware that the creature in front of him was just that, an animal, he might have thought it shot him a look of cold fury. It seemed to remark that he would pay for what he'd done. Still, the effect was lost when the cat was once more pulled into a terribly tight embrace by her mistress, and Naruto's smirk returned. He deserved to feed his sadistic side a pinch, what with how terrible that mission had been. They'd done a few D-ranked missions now, all of them crappy, annoying, or somewhere in between. They'd walked dogs, trimmed plants, and watched over small shops. It was boring, boring, boring. Hey, old man! Naruto shouted, walking over to where the third Hokage was standing, probably about to give them another D-rank mission. When are we gonna get to do actual ninja stuff? If the Hokage found his words annoying, he didn't make it known, taking a puff from his pipe, setting it down, and looking at Naruto with an amused expression. Is there something wrong with the missions I've had you on so far, Naruto? Yeah. They all suck. They're crappy missions. I don't know. He had been cut off when Sakura lightly smacked him on the back of the head, eyes narrowed slightly. Don't speak out of turn to the Hokage, you doofus! Naruto pouted, but didn't say anything. He'd learned over the course of their 3 or so years together that listening to Sakura was a good idea more often than not. At the same time, though, she turned towards where the old Kage sat, smiling apologetically. Is there any way we could get some more stimulating missions? So even she's bored. The third Hokage laughed softly, before smiling, his face crinkling with age. He looked up towards their third teammate. And what about you, young Sasuke, what do you think? The boy in question looked sheepish, not quite able to meet the old man's eyes, but still opened his mouth. I'd like something more challenging, as well. See, old man. Naruto stood up once more, massaging the back of his head where Sakura had smacked him. I told you we wanted some cooler missions. Oh yeah, I'm sure you were so concerned about what we wanted. Sakura muttered quietly from behind him, though easily loud enough for him to hear. He decided to ignore her. The Hokage merely laughed again, apparently amused by their antics, and turned at last towards their sensei. How about it, Kakashi? The old man's eyes twinkled with some foreign emotion, and Naruto didn't think himself smart enough to know exactly what it was. It seemed a bit like he was having fun. Do you think they're ready? The three students of Team 7 turned towards their sensei, pleading looks on their faces, though some were more subtle about it than others. Kakashi looked over them, and then, with a worldly sigh, turned back towards the Hokage. I suppose so. Yeah. Naruto jumped up, thrusting his fist into the sky. He walked over towards the mission desk. So, what kinds of missions do you have for us? I'd like it to be something simple to start, perhaps an escort mission? Sakura spoke up from beside him. I don't really care. Sasuke's face told Naruto that that statement was a lie, and that he in fact cared a lot. The third Hokage looked around, then took out a small scroll and handed it to their sensei. This is a C-ranked escort quest. Do you think they can handle it? The Jonin smiled under his mask, looking a bit exhausted. I'm sure they'll manage. All right then. He turned towards one of his assistants, and whispered, call him in. Yes, sir. The man spoke, before walking out of the room. Naruto could hardly contain his excitement. He bounced in place, trying to find something productive to do with his hands, but not really settling on anything. So, when he could handle it no longer, he spoke up, eyes glinting. Who is it we're escorting? The Hokage gave him a new look, and if it hadn't been on his teammates' faces just a while ago, as they watched that evil creature named Tora struggle in her master's arms, he probably wouldn't have recognized it. It was sadistic glee. Naruto wasn't sure why, but he felt a slight chill. I wonder what that means. Sasuke understood, now, why the Hokage had looked like he was about to laugh when he saw how excited Naruto was. He was probably thrilled to be rid of this guy. Ah man, look at you three, you look like you're trying so hard to be serious ninja, ha ha. I won't forgive old man third for this. Naruto spoke quietly, eyes narrowed as he stared out ahead of them, trying his best to ignore the constant barbs of their charge walking a bit behind them. His name was Tazuna, and he was a bridge builder. That was about all they'd gotten out of him before he'd started the endless tirade of deprecating comments, which had even managed to get on Sakura's nerves, if the pink-haired girl's clenched fists were anything to go by. It was with an almost palpable relief that he saw a small puddle in the middle of the dirt road, and exhaled, satisfied. A ninja was here, trying to kill them all? That meant that Tazuna would probably shut up. If their assailant survived this, Sasuke would have to thank him for that. He looked towards Naruto, and found the boy trying to meet his eyes as well. His friend nodded to him, and communicated the same thing to Sakura. They'd play it cool, since they all knew what was happening. An ambush was only effective if the party you were ambushing didn't know about it. A surprise attack without the element of surprise was often worse than a frontal assault, because you had to surrender control of the battle. Behind them, their sensei, Kakashi, nodded to each of them in turn. They all signaled back. They were ready. A second later, as they crossed over the small pool of water, the situation erupted. Twin ninja, wielding two massive gauntlets connected by a chain, charged at their sensei, aiming to take him out first. They wrapped the spiny chain around Kakashi, who grunted in pain as he struggled against it. Please, like he'd go down to such an assault. Kakashi was sliced into multiple pieces, each falling to the ground. There was a brief moment of silence, as Naruto, Sakura, and Sasuke all stared down at their master's corpse. Huh. Naruto froze, whether through fear or shock, Sasuke did not know, but that couldn't be his concern now. He leapt towards the ninja in front of them, and shouted out a command to those behind him. Sakura, protect the old man. Naruto, snap out of it. It seemed to work fairly well, because he saw Naruto bring out a kunai from behind him. Sakura herself took a position in front of Tazuna, just as he reached the twin ninjas that had killed his master. He was, momentarily, overcome with a small amount of grief. He hadn't liked Kakashi, but he didn't like most things, and he definitely didn't want to see the man carved into pieces by enemy ninja. It was a second later that he noticed his master's corpse looked suspiciously like a pile of logs, and Sasuke had to suppress both a sigh of relief and an annoyed groan. So, this is all just a test then? A clawed hand brought him out of his thoughts, and he dodged and weaved through the twin ninjas' first assault. That wasn't very hard. Sasuke noted as he landed in a squat position, shuriken drawn behind his back. They're not very good. An orange blur impacted one of the twins from behind, stunning him slightly. The man growled, just managing to block Naruto's concealed kunai with his gauntlet. He gripped onto the blonde boy's right arm and thrust him towards where Sasuke was standing, and he was just barely able to avoid colliding with Naruto as he came hurtling towards him. Naruto twirled in midair and rolled to a stop next to him, eyes hard and focused. Sasuke smirked. He taught him that landing, right down to drawing a shuriken in your offhand, in a way your opponent couldn't see, just in case you needed it. The sleight of hand had definitely won him a few early spars against the boy. And all the rest too, but that was more raw ability than any underhanded technique. You alright? Sasuke asked, not taking his eyes off the pair in front of them. Yeah, I'm fine. I'll take the right, you got the left? He heard Naruto laugh, and out of the corner of his eye, he saw the boy crouch a little lower, taking a more offensive stance. He was ready to move at any moment, just waiting on Sasuke's command. Go! They shot forward. So, Kakashi began, backing his words with a small amount of killing intent, likely for the purposes of interrogation. You lied to us? The bridge builder, who Sakura had been guarding while the other two fought off the ninja, didn't meet the Jonin's eyes. I didn't have a choice, you see. Those people, Gato's men, they'd been milking our village dry. We didn't have the money to request anything more than a C-ranked mission. Sakura grimaced slightly. It wasn't the answer she'd been hoping for. She didn't want the man in front of her to actually have a good reason for his lie. She wanted him to be a slime ball, willing to throw away the lives of junior ninja because he didn't feel like paying for a higher-ranked mission, not some village hero. From the looks of things, Naruto and Sasuke were having similar thoughts, looking down to the floor with conflicted expressions. Yes, that's all well and good, but my team isn't equipped to take on missions against actual trained ninjas. Kakashi pointed back over to the twin pair they'd captured, who sat a ways away, wrapped in their own chain. Those two were low chunin level, no doubt about it. For me, and even my team here, they're no problem at all. Then you'll continue. Tazuna looked up at their sensei, desperately searching for confirmation that they'd help him. I cannot allow that. The man before them deflated instantly. I may be able to handle them, and those stronger, but my team? He gestured to the three of them. They are just genin, and if what you're telling me is correct, then this Gato has probably hired people stronger than even those two over there. The bridge builder winced, looking down with a defeated expression. Sensei? All eyes turned towards her, and Sakura realized with some surprise that it was her who'd spoke. What is it, Sakura? She took a deep breath and raised her head to look her teacher in the eye. I'd like to continue the mission. Kakashi's single eye widened. I would as well, sensei. Yeah. Me too. Their sensei looked over the three of them, a complicated expression on his face as he examined each of them. Whatever he found there seemed to amuse him, for he laughed a second later, and then turned towards the dejected bridge builder on the ground. Well, Tazuna, it seems you're in luck. Really? The honest joy in the man's voice was enough to make Sakura smile earnestly, and she could see her own expression mirrored onto the faces of her teammates. She would have felt pretty bad to have to abandon this man's village, along with the man himself, who was already being hunted by ninja. We'll take your mission. Oh, that's great. I was worried I'd have to start guilting you all in a moment or two, ha ha ha. Okay, so maybe Sakura wouldn't have felt that bad. Zabuza, sir, a voice called out to him from just outside his room. Thought soon their identity was revealed, Haku stepping in a moment later. The demon brothers were unsuccessful. TSK. That was an annoyance, and one he hadn't particularly felt like dealing with. Still, it wasn't a problem. The demon brothers were just a throwaway, two kids who'd followed him and Haku out of the mist after their failed coup. They were expendable, and expended they'd been. That's fine, Haku. Zabuza turned to look at the boy stood before him, who was eyeing him curiously. I suppose I'll just have to do this myself. Haku nodded towards him, smiling softly. The boy had never once doubted him, and for that, Zabuza was grateful. It wouldn't do for a tool to go having thoughts. After all, he was still useful like this. Malleable, moldable, and growing stronger by the day. Zabuza was also, in the deepest depths of his mind, the smallest bit proud. He'd never say it, of course, but he could oftentimes find himself thinking of the boy as a surrogate son. After all, he'd picked him up off the street when he was just a weak child, barely able to fend for himself. Perhaps I'm going soft, Zabuza thought with a small chuckle. What is it, Zabuza, sir? Haku had a small smile on his face, likely in response to Zabuza's own laughing, though he was fairly sure the boy didn't even realize it. Nothing, kid. He walked over to the corner of the room, where his great sword, Kubikiribocho, rested against the wall. He took hold of it and smiled fondly at the familiar weight in his hand. The sword had an odd knack of calming him down whenever he held it, though that was probably just his battlefield instincts, always feeling safer, more at ease, with a weapon in hand. I'll be heading out. No need to follow me, I'll have this done in an hour. He'd said that, but the both of them knew that Haku would be trailing behind him whether he told him to or not. The boy did nod, but he couldn't quite meet Zabuza's eye. Humph, he breathed out a laugh, opening the door to their small abode, and stepping out into the cold, foggy air. Maybe that brat really was turning him soft, though he'd kill anyone for saying anything like that about him. He smiled quietly to himself, almost affectionately. Damned brat. Zabuza found him, or perhaps them, a while later, walking in a group and watching their flanks. They didn't spot him, wouldn't, unless he desired them to. He was not called the silent assassin for nothing. Still, though, that was a face he hadn't expected to see. Kakashi Hatake. He'd never met the man before, and if he was willing to be perfectly honest with himself, he never really wanted to either. Zabuza did not think himself weak, nor that any could truly be that much stronger than he was. Still, the thought of facing someone perhaps even more well-known than him. A twinge of fear coursed through him, before he mercilessly slaughtered it. Fear was good, it kept you alive, after all. It was what had allowed humans to grow from primitive apes to the apex predator of all the lands. But fear on the battlefield? That was not always to be heralded. Any soldier, no matter how brave, nor virtuous, nor strong, felt some level of fear. Instincts bred by thousands of years told you that if your life was in danger, flee. Things were rarely that simple. And so, as he flung his massive blade towards the crowd of ninjas ahead, hoping, but not really expecting, for it to cleave them in twain, Zabuza made himself feel an eerie calm. It wasn't any particular ability that allowed him to do it. He didn't have a jutsu that could make him feel no fear. But he had experience. He'd personally caused hundreds, if not thousands of deaths with his own hands. His classmates in the academy, his opponents on the battlefield, hell, he tried to kill his own Kage. It was what he'd had to do, sometimes wanted to do, so he'd done it. After all that time, all that killing, well, it just didn't affect him like it used to. The thought of killing some kids? That didn't appeal, but he'd do it to continue to eke out this life he had now. One where they were constantly hunted, at every turn by the Mist Village, but one they'd need to continue on with if he was to have his revenge, and finally see the Mizukage bleed on his blade. He was a merciless demon, a wielder of one of the 7 blades of the mist, known throughout the world. He was not one to show any mercy, not even to young brats fresh off of academy training. But maybe if he'd aimed his sword just a little higher than he probably should have, making it easy for them to duck underneath it, especially for the younger-looking genin? Then perhaps he was just losing his touch. Kakashi, having sensed the attack, yelled for the group to get down, and the children all just managed to avoid being bisected. He nearly had to clamp down on his relief. Why should I care? Zabuza found himself asking. He knew the answer, even if he didn't want to. Damned brat. Unfortunately for him, it meant he'd lost the element of surprise, and with nothing to show for it, either. Perhaps the rabbit substitution he'd used earlier had been too obvious. It was native to his homeland, after all, but definitely not to this land of waves. He'd have to tame a new one later, preferably one that blended in a bit more. Still, he had a job to do. He felt the muscles in his body tighten as he prepared for combat. Something within him howled its assent, perhaps some petty demon. Or perhaps just me. With a few small hand signs, he flash-stepped on top of his sword, letting it support his weight, and stood ready to counter anything they'd throw at him. Zabuza Momochi, rogue ninja of the Mist Village. It was Kakashi who spoke, eyes narrowed and weapons readied, though he still covered his left eye. Everyone of a certain level had heard of the Sharingan. It wasn't exactly kept secret. The fact that the entire clan had been all but wiped out had led to some brief celebrations from people outside the Leaf. They'd never have to face that eye again on the battlefield. Or they wouldn't have had to, if not for Kakashi Hatake, one of the most powerful jonin in the world. Word of his Sharingan had been going back as far as the Third Shinobi World War, and Zabuza could personally remember hearing about him in some of the later skirmishes. A rogue ninja? The heck is that? It was one of the genin who spoke, one with blonde hair and blue eyes, though the boy was squinting up at him from where he stood on the ground. A ninja who has abandoned their village or was cast out in disgrace. Kakashi spoke authoritatively, stepping calmly in front of the children who were likely his students, guarding them from him. In this case, both. Zabuza smirked beneath the bandages that covered the lower half of his face, and stepped down onto the ground, gripping his sword in his hand. He cast his eyes over the 3 students behind the jonin, who were standing in a fairly standard formation around his target, Tazuna. They had drawn weapons, but none of them looked particularly confident in using them. He'd hazard a guess that the kids had never seen their teacher look so serious before. The man in front of him certainly seemed calm enough, though. His eye was sharply focused on Zabuza's own and gave away nothing. Only a cold sense of preparation and a promise. It told him, "I will kill you." He had to laugh as he swung his massive blade to rest on his shoulder, posture relaxed, yet ready to swing into battle at a moment's notice. He'd kill them all, truly he would. He didn't want to have to kill these kids, they reminded him a bit too much of his own, and wasn't that a scary thought? He considered Haku his, but he'd still do it if they gave him no choice. He'd give them a choice first, though. "I'll ask just the once," he pointed his sword forward, holding it up with pure brutish strength. "Surrender your charge, and I'll have no reason to kill the rest of you." The group didn't respond, instead, they tightened their formation, with Kakashi walking just a bit closer to them, but moving his free hand to rest on his headband, to pull it up and expose his hidden eye if needed. Zabuza exhaled disappointedly, but brought his sword up, and readied himself for combat. In Naruto's opinion, things could have been going better. Their sensei had been captured, held in a watery prison, and suspended a few feet in the air, while he and Sasuke tried desperately to dispel the clone of the man who'd been roughing them up nonstop for the past 20 minutes. Which seemed weird to him, because he was pretty sure this guy could have killed all of them by now, but he just wasn't. Well, not his place to question luck, who'd all of a sudden decided that Naruto was her favorite person. He rolled to the side as the massive blade pierced the earth, digging a good foot or so into the ground, before, with a strength he could only dream of, the man attacking them ripped it back up. He stared at the two of them, and then at Sakura ways back, who was guarding Tazuna. He seemed intrigued, perhaps he'd expected less of a fight from them. Kakashi had told them to leave, and honestly, Naruto didn't think it was all that bad of an idea himself, but the other two hadn't so much as budged when the man said it, so he'd done the only thing he really could do and stuck around as well. It wasn't a mistake, it was never a mistake to be able to protect his friends, but he couldn't say he didn't regret it just a tad, as the small cuts and bruises on his body continued to build up. Sasuke was fighting beside him, ducking behind Zabuza's blade, and trying to plunge a kunai into the clone that faced the two of them, only for it to juke away just in time to avoid it. They'd not managed to even scratch the clone the entire time they'd been fighting. "Naruto," he spoke up, panting slightly and wiping sweat away from his brow. "This isn't working." And the winner of the most obvious statement ever award goes to. "Yeah, I got that." Another dodge, another cut, though this one was a little deeper than the last, scoring him just below his shoulder. "Naruto?" "Yeah. You remember the underhanded things I used to do in spars that you hated?" He growled just thinking about them. "Yeah. Use them." Well, that was vague, even if it was good advice. They were outmatched in conventional battle, that much was obvious. Fight dirty, and they might just win. The next time that Zabuza's blade cut across him, and he just barely ducked down beneath it, Naruto reached back into his tool bag and drew two shuriken, masking the motion as him trying to regain his balance. He did a backflip away from the man's sword, just outside of his range, and waited for Sasuke to make his move. It wasn't obvious, and to anyone else, it probably wouldn't have even been a signal at all. But it was exaggerated, the way that Sasuke fell off balance the next time he dodged the man's strike, falling to his side and having to roll away, lest he be cut in twain. It was a feint. The boy threw two kunai as he exited the motion. Neither of them had expected that to work, though, and the clone in front of them batted one of the kunai away with the back of his hand, and simply sidestepped the other. That was fine, even as he ducked under the shuriken Naruto threw, it didn't matter. He was never the target. It was a quiet victory, really, as the Zabuza that stood beside their sensei suddenly recoiled in pain and shock. After all, he probably hadn't expected a second shuriken hiding in the shadow of Naruto's first. It wasn't a particularly advanced maneuver either. It was just a mean-spirited trick between friends. It was just an attack Sasuke had pulled out of his ass one day when Naruto wasn't expecting it. He still had the scar, directly under his right breast. Zabuza would too, it seemed, as he stumbled briefly. For anyone else, such a movement wouldn't have constituted a moment of weakness, something that could be capitalized on. Kakashi-sensei was not just anyone else. The man sent a burst of chakra into the bubble in front of him, on the opposite side from where Zabuza was pouring it in. The weakest point, Naruto assumed. It came apart with a satisfying pop. Their teacher wasted no time. There was no interim moment. Zabuza had been stood, briefly stunned, and the next, he was blasted back several meters, with Kakashi already beginning to make the signs for his next jutsu. Naruto smirked as the clone stood in front of the two of them, melted into the dirt, made entirely of water as it was. Sasuke turned around, looking presumably for Sakura, and nodded to her to signal that they were both okay. "Stay away, you three," Kakashi spoke calmly. His hands finally came to a stop, forming the sign tiger. "I'll handle things from here." He looked towards them, giving them a small smile. "And also, well done." Their sensei leapt into action. It took only a minute for Kakashi to defeat their assailant. Which raised the question, for Sasuke at least, why he hadn't started with the Sharingan and ended this little fight before it could escalate. Such questions were pointless, however. No one had been severely injured, despite Naruto's constant hissing as he poked and prodded his scratched-up arms, so he couldn't really blame their teacher much at all. Still though, the Sharingan. Sasuke's teeth clenched, even as he tried to hide his true feelings from the outside world. Naruto settled his hand on his shoulder a second later, however, nodding towards him in a "you okay" kind of gesture, so it seemed he'd failed there. He sighed, and with a great deal of effort, resigned to ask about this later. He nodded down towards Naruto, and they watched as Kakashi closed in on the defeated form of Zabuza, slumped against a tree. Whether he'd kill their assailant or not, Sasuke didn't particularly care. Anyone who attacked his friends had, in Sasuke's eyes, already forfeited their life. Though even he couldn't quite hold back his surprise at seeing 2 needles pierce the man's neck, killing him before Kakashi could so much as make a move. What the Naruto spoke, understandably confused. Come on, we'll go assist. Sakura, he turned back to see the girl once more ready to defend Tazuna, kunai at the ready, eyes just as sharp. Never mind, you're way ahead of me. Pfft, I'm always ahead of you, she smiled briefly, but killed it a second later. Go you two, I've got this. They both made a small noise of acknowledgement, before running over to where their teacher stood. It took them a few seconds to make it to where Kakashi was, and by that time, he'd already started conversing with the figure who'd killed Zabuza. They weren't very tall, perhaps 5 foot or so, but they spoke with a calmness beyond their years, for Sasuke couldn't see them as being any older than 16. We've been hunting this one a while. I simply wanted to thank you for your assistance. The ninja took a deep bow, before taking one of their assailant's arms around their shoulder and hauling him up. It was no issue at all. Kakashi himself looked tired, and Sasuke felt it was actually quite a large issue, but remained silent nonetheless. Well, I'll be off. I have to return this back to the Mist Village. And with one final hand sign, the boy in front of them disappeared, along with the body. Hey, Kakashi-sensei? It was Naruto who spoke up, wearing a conflicted expression. How old do you think that guy was? Their teacher didn't answer for a second, instead putting away the kunai he held in his right hand into his tool bag, and then turning to face the blonde boy. Perhaps. I'd put him around 14 or 15. Naruto hissed, looking down at his hands. But he was strong enough to finish off that Zabuza guy. How could? Naruto brought his hands together, clenching them both. How could he be so much stronger than me? There was a brief moment of silence, in which Kakashi walked to stand before the two of them. Not all villages raise their cadets the same way. The Mist Village is particularly brutal. Sasuke looked down at his feet. So, what Zabuza said about killing one's classmates, that was true. They may end up being stronger in the short term, but... Kakashi shook his head, sighing deeply. They're certainly not able to hold up later in life. They're just too broken. Their teacher turned to look Naruto in the eye. Answer me this, Naruto. If you knew you could be as strong as him, but you had to kill one of your classmates to do it, Kakashi's eyes became hard. The Sharingan seemed to gaze directly into the boy's soul. Would you? Naruto looked stunned for but a moment, before he looked away, clenching his jaw. Of course not. Kakashi smiled gently, though it was partially hidden behind his mask. He rubbed Naruto's hair, messing it up, and earning a small squawk of protest, before he stepped by him and started walking over to where Sakura and Tazuna stood, still on guard. As they followed him, Sasuke thought about what their sensei had said. If you had to kill one of your classmates to do it, you must kill your closest friend. A shiver ran down his spine, and Sasuke briefly stopped, too shaken to move. Naruto brought him out of it a second later, a hand on his shoulder, as he looked his friend in the eye. You alright, Sasuke? He exhaled rapidly, trying to control his breathing. When he finally felt a little better, he looked at his friend and smiled gratefully. Yeah. Thanks, Naruto. The boy smiled goofily, instantly dispelling some of the fog that hovered around his mind. I'll reject your strength, Itachi, and grow stronger my own way. They followed behind their sensei, rushing a bit to catch up to him. A second later, the man stumbled. Kakashi-sensei, are you? He fell without a word. Chapter 6. I've got him, you guys get the door. Tazuna held out an old, rusted key to him, which Sasuke took and twisted into the lock. Hearing a faint click, he twisted the knob and opened the door. The bridge builder let him hold Kakashi's left side once more, walking into the house first. Team 7 followed behind him a second later, and Sasuke got his first real look at the man's home. The place was, perhaps quaint was the nicest word for it. Tezuna's home was easily larger than Sasuke's own apartment, though that wasn't exactly saying much. It was 2 stories, though that certainly didn't make it ornate. The wood was coming apart in multiple places, whether from wear or termites he couldn't be sure, and a nail or 2 stuck out from what looked to be recent attempts to patch some things up. There was a small shelf to his left, and Sasuke briefly examined the picture frame that lay atop of it. In it were 2 people he didn't know, and Tezuna himself. Though judging from the hand coming from outside the ripped photo, there had used to be a 4th person in it as well. He wondered what the story was there. On his right, there was a dining room, though calling it that was a bit unfair. It was completely barren except for a table and 4 chairs. Straight ahead was a stairway that likely led to the 2nd story, and on his left was a mostly empty room, though a few futons were haphazardly scattered about it. "Lay him down in here," Tezuna spoke up, gesturing to one of the mats. Sasuke and Naruto nodded, carrying their sensei between them. They had left Sakura on guard duty, which was a risk, since she was the worst of them with traditional offensive justice, but her sense for chakra was better than theirs as well. She would have been able to tell someone was coming for them faster than either of the other members of Team 7 could. Luckily for all of them, no one had. They laid Kakashi down onto the bedded floor, being careful not to shake him too much. They weren't exactly sure what was wrong. The man had collapsed before he could say anything about it. Sasuke had an idea though. It wasn't unheard of. Back in the days of the Warring States period, his father had once told him, for enemy ninja to try and steal the Sharingan, and implant them into their own eyes. It was very rarely successful, since the Uchiha were the 2nd fiercest clan of the era, but a few had, apparently, managed it. According to his father, a non-Uchiha using the Sharingan would lead to heavy exhaustion, horrible migraines, and even fainting spells. He had questions to ask his teacher when the man woke up, about how he'd gotten that eye, and gotten so proficient at using it. Still, those could wait for now. "You guys can make yourselves at home." Tezuna gestured depressingly at the room, which Sasuke felt just about summarized its state. "It's not much, I know, but it's more than enough." Sakura spoke up, bowing lightly to the man, before setting her stuff down and sitting on one of the small futons. Their client didn't seem to know how to take the compliment, as shallow as they all knew it was, staring owlishly for a moment, before he made his way out into the hallway, and up the central stairs. "That was nice of you." Sasuke looked back towards where Sakura was stationed, leaning back against the wall with her eyes closed. "I didn't really know what else to say." He made a small noise of acknowledgement, before turning to their last team member. "Naruto, how are you?" The boy was fast asleep, laying on his face, with his behind arched comically into the air. Sasuke sighed but couldn't help the smile that bloomed on his face. "We should probably follow his example. I wish we could both just sleep, but..." He looked out of the small window, eyeing for anyone that may be trying to ambush them. "We just don't know if someone will attack. And with Kakashi-sensei down, it's especially dangerous." Sakura nodded towards him. "I'll take first watch then. I didn't do any of the fighting today. The least I can do is watch your backs while you sleep." She smiled to show she was just kidding, but Sasuke could see some of the lingering pain behind her eyes. She didn't like sitting on the sidelines. "Thanks then, I'll leave it to you." He walked over to the only unclaimed futon on the ground and laid down upon it. It was nothing at all compared to his bed back home, but it was a bit better than lying on the cold floor, so he wouldn't complain. He hadn't just accepted because he felt bad for her, but also because he was truly exhausted. He and Naruto had first fought off those twin ninja with the chain, then walked a few hours to get to the land of waves, fought against Zabuza, and then carried their unconscious teacher through the back streets. Still though, he did want to talk with Sakura, learn how she felt about all this stuff. She was one of his friends, and someone he treasured deeply. Seeing her upset wasn't something he cared much for at all. As sleep took him, the only things he saw were the blazing red eyes of the Sharingan. His brother's eyes. Sasuke woke up far quicker than he really wanted to, having slept a measly 4 hours, but he'd have to make do. Kakashi was awake. "I'm really sorry about all that, you three." He rubbed the back of his neck a bit sheepishly. I caused you an awful lot of trouble. It was a bit awkward for him to hear their teacher apologize, and he squirmed in place. Hey, you saved us, so we saved you, right? Naruto was the first to speak up, smiling brightly as he sat up from out of his bedding. Seems fair enough to me. Both he and Sakura nodded at that, turning to face their sensei with smiles adorning their faces. Hey, you three. Well, alright. I assume you'll be wanting an explanation for all that? Yep. Yeah. On the double. Their teacher laughed, his exposed right eye crinkling as he shook with mirth. Sasuke was pretty sure he already knew, but it would probably be a better idea to have Kakashi confirm it, which would also mean that he didn't have to speak for a long time. Talking to others for a while was fine, but he'd be lying if he said he enjoyed prolonged periods of interaction. And so Kakashi gave them exactly the explanation he'd been expecting, that he had received a Sharingan in the past, and that using it exhausted him afterwards. Sasuke had initially tried to ask where he'd gotten it from, but the reaction from the man told him that he'd best not tread any further. It wasn't hostile, but more evasive. It didn't seem, to him at least, that Kakashi had killed anyone to get the Sharingan. He was fairly sure no Hokage would have let him get away with that. It seemed more like guilt that kept him from telling them. So, he'd held off, and when the man neared the end of his story, the whole group had just about managed to shake off the lingering feelings of exhaustion. Though none more than Naruto, who was back to his usual, boisterous self. But man, Kakashi-sensei, you had us worried. We thought you'd been poisoned or something. I mean, you collapsed out of nowhere. The boy was laughing, but Sasuke could tell that he was just trying to dispel the last dregs of worried energy that still hung around him. It had been a bit disturbing to see the man almost die twice in one day. Sasuke felt a bit guilty. He'd held off on sharing his hypothesis about Kakashi's fainting spell, instead leaving the group to stew in uncertainty. He'd have to apologize later, even if he had wanted to hold on to his idea on the off chance he was wrong. It would have been bad to tell them everything was fine on a theory, only for Kakashi to end up dying from poison. They talked about this and that, trying to cheer themselves up a bit after their many battles, and subsequent lack of sleep, before they were interrupted by a small, black-haired child. Grandpa! The boy rushed in and hugged Tazuna, who seemed delighted to see him. Ah, Inari! I was looking for you earlier, where have you been? The boy doesn't say anything, instead pushing his head further into his grandfather's embrace, though the old man doesn't seem to mind, instead relishing in it, laughing boisterously. The young child Inari, apparently, looked up at them, his eyes darkening. Grandpa, who are these guys? Oh, these are the ninja who brought your grandpa some safe, Inari. The child stepped away from his grandfather, eyes hard. They're all going to die. At that, Naruto stood up, apparently so stunned he couldn't think to say anything. Sasuke himself felt a bit surprised, even if it was muted. He was able to think back to the photo in the hallway, and the events in his mind started to form a pretty clear picture. What? Inari, you shouldn't. What the hell are you talking about, you little brat? Naruto was in front of the boy now, arms crossed defiantly in front of him. You see this? You're looking at certified grade A ninja right there. You think you can beat Gato? Ha! Yeah, right. No one can, you're all going to die. Inari practically flew out of the room, pouting with tears running down his face. The three remaining members of Team 7 had stayed quiet, but Naruto was up on his feet, practically seething. I'm sorry about him. A woman walking into the room spoke up, looking downcast. Things have been hard for him lately. The four of them stood silently, not quite sure what to say to that, deciding to simply let the woman continue. My apologies, she held a hand over her chest, bowing slightly. My name is Tsunami, thank you for taking care of my father. Sasuke nodded, along with Sakura, and even Naruto seemed to preen a little at the praise, though it didn't last for long, and the boy was back to silently brooding a second later. You see. A while later, and one depressing backstory richer, Sasuke stalked up the stairs of Tsunami's house. He had, contrary to what he'd told Naruto, come for a reason. The upper floor was no grander than the lower, but it clearly saw less traffic. There were 2 bedrooms, one of which was locked up tight. It was that which he'd come for. He walked over to it and gave it a light knock. "Hello, Inari? I'm one of the ninjas." "Go away." Yeah, he'd expected that. "I'd just like to talk to you. I heard about what happened with your father, and—" "Go away!" Forceful, and to the point. The boy just wanted him gone. He just wanted to sit up here and stew and die. Sasuke understood, of course. This had been him, once upon a time. So instead of walking away, like he was fairly sure most other people would have, he brought out one of Sakura's hairpins and brought it to the lock. Picking a lock wasn't an incredibly useful skill, especially in a society where it was often far easier to destroy a locked door than open one, but Sasuke hadn't picked it up for any practical use in the field. No, instead, he'd picked it up because, as it turned out, you didn't get to be the friend of one of Konoha's most famous pranksters without learning a few tricks. Honestly, at first Sasuke had thought his own involvement in Naruto's life would result in the boy losing his desire to play pranks, but just like almost all of the other things he'd thought about Naruto, he'd been proven wrong. Instead of reforming the student, Naruto had instead managed to drag him into all of his pranks. Honestly, his parents would have been furious with him. He still remembered trying to talk the prankster out of graffitiing the Hokage monument for a solid 5 or so days, only for the boy to not only convince him to go along with it, but to actively help. As it turned out, he had no actual backbone when it came to standing up to Naruto. Especially since, most of the time, he didn't want to anyways. Despite what he may have said about him, and the pranks they got up to, he couldn't deny he laughed a hell of a lot more when they were hanging out. Hell, he instigated their pranks on occasion. He smiled just thinking about it, before focusing back in on the task at hand. With a soft click, the lock came undone. What are you doing here?" Inari was sat on the bed, his hands trying to cover his tear-ridden eyes from view, sniffling quietly. Seeing it, Sasuke couldn't help but feel a twinge of pity, but also a flash of something else. Anger. He didn't let it show, though, because that wouldn't have been fair. It was like remembering old memories about yourself before drifting off to sleep and cringing about how foolish you once were. He felt that same way now. He had wallowed in his misery for 3 months, not doing anything other than walk to and from his apartment and the academy. But Inari wouldn't have any context for what he'd be saying. Sasuke had been given 3 years to truly get past his grief, and even then, he sometimes didn't feel like he was. The boy in front of him had lost his father only a few weeks ago, the wound was still fresh. But still, someone needed to help him stand up. It had been Naruto to snap him out of it, but he could still remember the way he'd felt back then. He hadn't wanted help, or at least, he didn't think he'd wanted it. It was only after he was given that help that he realized that he needed it, and desperately. This time, Sasuke was determined to be that helping hand. "I'm sorry about breaking in, but I felt like we needed to talk." He spoke calmly, assuredly. He needed to have this conversation, for Inari of course, but also for himself. He felt if he confronted this boy, he'd also be confronting himself at the same time. This might finally let him find the closure he'd been searching for these past years. "Get out." But boy, was he making this hard. "I wanted to talk to you about what happened with your father, I know it." "Yeah. I heard. Now get out." Really hard. Swallowing his annoyance, Sasuke walked to the edge of Inari's bed, despite his continued protest, and sat down upon it, remaining silent for a few seconds as the boy went back to sobbing into his knees, curling into a small ball. The boy's outrage seemed to have exhausted him, for he stopped crying a minute or two later, and looked up at Sasuke inquisitively. "What do you want?" "Your father." "Yeah, I know that," Inari growled, hands clenching into fists, before he looked away, shame filling his face. The kid probably wasn't used to being so quick to anger, and it was getting to his mood as well. "I should know," Sasuke thought, "I used to have the same problem." He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck with his hand, and tried to come up with something to say that wouldn't immediately be met with hostility. "Well, I could always start with my story." That might work. He waited a few more minutes, during which Inari started and stopped crying once again, and Sasuke formulated just what he wanted to say. When he was confident enough to speak, he began. I won't talk about your father, if you don't want to. He looked over towards Inari, who didn't look particularly pleased by that, but didn't immediately shout at him either, which was as good a sign he was going to get. I'll talk about what happened to me, I suppose? It's why I came up here. He cleared his throat a bit awkwardly. He knew what he wanted to say once he got into it, but starting was a little harder. I guess I'll just come out and say it. 3 years ago, my entire clan was murdered on the same night. That got a response from the boy, who looked up at him in shock and, to his eternal annoyance, pity. Kid, you're like 8 years old, you don't get to feel bad for me. Why, who would do that? Sasuke smiled a bit bitterly. My brother, actually. If it was possible for the boy in front of him to get any more shocked, he managed it. My brother single-handedly murdered every single member of the Uchiha clan, except for myself. He was getting a bit angry, a bit upset, but he reeled it back in. It wouldn't do for him to yell at Inari when he was supposed to be comforting him, empathizing with him. He didn't even spare me, just allowed me to live, because I was so utterly pathetic. The darkness within him crept up to the surface, and for a brief moment, it was all he knew. I was too pathetic to be worth killing. Naruto and Sakura had, once or twice, asked him why he hated the pity of others so much. It wasn't like it hurt him, after all, it was just people trying to help him get by. It wasn't their fault that they didn't understand, and he never blamed them, either. But the only reason Itachi had chosen to let him live was that he hadn't thought him worth the effort. His own psychotic brother had thought him so feeble, so small and weak, that he'd shown him pity in sparing his life. He didn't want pity from anyone, never wanted it. It had been pride before, but after Itachi, it always felt like he was being attacked when they gave him their charity. He didn't care if they had good reason to want to help him, didn't care that maybe he really did need the help. He hadn't wanted it, hadn't desired it from anyone. They'd forced it upon him, a free meal here, supplementary lessons there. It was just them trying to make themselves feel better, it didn't. Mr. Ninja, sir? The darkness shrouding his mind parted, just a little. It was enough, however, for him to look and see the boy in front of him, worry written all over his face. How long was I spaced out? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. No! Don't be! Inari practically shouted out, before his gaze fell to the bed again, unable to meet Sasuke's eyes. He looked back up a few seconds later, a complicated mess of emotions. I understand that sometimes you get caught in your own head. Sasuke's own eyes widened, albeit briefly. Well, it's progress. But, your own brother. The boy in front of him fiddled with his hands, not quite knowing what to do with them. I'm sorry, I can't imagine what that must have been like. You don't have to be sorry, you had nothing to do with it. Inari nodded, though his energy seemed even more subdued than before. The boy in front of him sat forward a little, sitting cross-legged on his bed now. Did my grandfather tell you to talk to me? No, I came because I wanted to. The boy sighed wearily, with far more pain than any child should have ever had to endure. He knew the feeling intimately. Do you mind if I ask you some things? Inari looked up at him, his eyes free of tears, but still holding a lingering sadness. Sasuke couldn't help but smile at the effort. Sure. Do you ever feel any better? The boy's voice cracked while he spoke, and he looked away from him out of shame. You do. The boy's eyes widened, and he turned to Sasuke with the barest hints of hope in his eyes. Really? Yeah, it was quite difficult to describe accurately, but he felt he might as well try. It's not really something you ever fully get over. It's more like, it gets easier and easier, until one day you're just sort of, not fixed, but better. Inari leaned in, eyes focused, wanting to hear more of what Sasuke had to say. He couldn't blame the boy either, he had wanted some miracle cure as well, all those years ago. How long does that take? I feel like it's been forever, but the boy stumbled over his words as tears formed in his eyes, though he sniffled once and dispelled them. But I don't feel any better at all. It feels like it only just happened yesterday. He remembered walking into the Uchiha district after he'd woken up, walking around streets that used to be so brimming with people that you could barely find anywhere to move. He remembered seeing them barren, with white tape on the ground where bodies had been recovered. He had found his aunt and uncle's shop, had seen the white tape inside it. He'd stared and stared at the white tape, that was used to represent someone's final moments. They'd been embracing when Itachi cut them down, knowing it was the last time they'd ever be able to. He'd found their son as well, the tape in the closet, along with the blood stain. His parents had tried to hide him, tried to protect him. And Itachi had just slaughtered him too. The boy had been 7 years old. He remembered walking into his own home, reliving the events of that night over and over again, wondering if he'd been stronger, if he'd trained harder, if he'd done better, if he'd talked to them more, then just maybe the regret pooling inside of him wouldn't have been so agonizing. Deep down, he knew that no matter what, he would have felt that way. He knew deep down that it wasn't his fault. It didn't make it hurt any less. It felt like empty words, he told himself, empty words the therapists threw at him as they tried to get him back on his feet. Even they had never dealt with a case quite so grisly as his. I don't know how long it takes to feel better. What? Inari looked desolated with the news, but Sasuke continued before he could get another word in. I don't remember when it happened. It wasn't something that I noticed or could identify. I don't think I truly realized that I felt better about it until, probably a year or so afterwards. Inari blanched, looking downtrodden as his eyes fell. A whole year? It took me a year to realize, not a year to feel better. Sasuke put a hand on the boy's shoulder, propping him up a little. But I will let you in on a little secret. What kind of secret? It's how you could feel better a lot quicker. Would you want that? The boy looked up at him with no small amount of wonder, eyes wide. Why, yeah. How do I do that? Sasuke smiled, looking down at the hopeful boy before him, hoping that he would present some magical cure-all for the problems he faced. It was a cure, surely, but it wasn't going to be easy like he hoped. What really helped bring me out of my drought, he gestured back towards the door of the room, and downstairs, where several loud cries could be heard, coming from a certain obnoxiously loud blonde, were my friends. Huh? Around the time I met Naruto, I was stewing and festering in my own hate. I had been for months already. I needed something to break me out of it, needed to feel a bit better about who I was and what had happened. And then that idiot came stumbling down a hill, and I helped him up. Sasuke stood up off of the bed, walking around it and over to the door, resting his hand on the doorknob. We talked about nothing at all, most of the time, but it was something different. It kept me out of my head, kept me focusing on the real world. By the time I thought about it, I realized I wasn't even all that sad anymore. It was just a lingering feeling, like a scab that's still healing a few days after a cut. Sasuke looked back towards the boy, smiling a bit embarrassedly. He saved me, even if I'll probably never admit it to him. Inari looked dumbfounded, and a little angry, like he'd been tricked into getting one of his grandfather's lectures. He had been, truthfully, even if it wasn't his grandfather who'd come up with it. That didn't change the truth, though. I think your mother and grandfather just want to help you. He smiled knowingly, because he could tell that Inari knew that deep down. He had never doubted that for a second, he just didn't want to hear it. And I think you'd feel a lot better if you let them. And with that, he opened the door and walked out. Or he would have, if not for the voice that shouted, "Wait!" Sasuke turned back, a bit confused, and was nearly knocked over as the boy tackled him into a hug, Inari's face buried in his shirt. I am sorry for yelling at you. I wasn't. I'm not. I know. He smiled affectionately at the boy, his face lighting up. I was there once too. Thank you? He mumbled back. Will you come have dinner with your family later? I think they'd love to see you. The boy didn't say anything, but he did nod into his chest, sniffling once or twice, before he backed away, sitting back down on his bed, and giving Sasuke as bright a smile as he could manage. I'll try. Sasuke smiled back, feeling a small weight leave his shoulders. That's all I ask? He stepped out of the room and closed the door behind him. Sasuke gave a quiet thank you to Tsunami as the woman set a plate in front of him. It was scarce, but it would be enough for a full meal. He'd have never asked for more, either, knowing just how poor this country, and the people who lived in it, truly was. Naruto and Sakura sat beside him on his left, arguing loudly about something or another, though they clearly weren't actually mad at one another. There was too much passion in their words, and not enough anger. Upon listening in further, Sasuke discovered they were talking about ramen, of all things, and found himself laughing. Naruto's favorite hangout spot had become a favorite of all of theirs, and Sasuke could say with fair certainty that Ichiraku was the best ramen place in Konoha. Still though, as he listened to their argument, he couldn't help but scoff at how idiotic it was. You know that Shoyu is better. I don't even know why we're having this discussion. Sakura shouted out, looking for all the world like she may snap and kill Naruto. Miso is way better than your crappy Shoyu. Don't get mad at me just because your taste buds don't work. The boy fired back, standing up on his chair and pointing at the girl. Tsunami leaned in next to him, smirking amusedly. Are they always like this? Oh yeah? The woman laughed. I'm sorry then. She spoke as she walked away, smiling to show she meant no ill will, and headed back into the kitchen to finish bringing everything out. Honestly, his friends could be so embarrassing sometimes. It was obvious that tonkatsu ramen was superior to all other kinds. He wasn't even sure why the idiots bothered arguing about something so basic. Ah, you're all here already. Tozuna stepped in, wobbling a little bit, and Sasuke couldn't help but notice the man's reddened cheeks. Father, I told you to lay off drinking while we have guests here. Tsunami spoke quietly, probably trying to keep them from hearing her, though her annoyance caused her voice to carry a bit further than intended. Ah, did you? Oh. That's right, you did. He brought his daughter into a tight hug, laughing wildly. I'm sorry, Nami-chan. Don't call me that. The woman squirmed, looking back at the three of them and going red in the face at seeing they were trying not to laugh. Get off me! With one final push, the drunken man stumbled off of her, stepping to the side and burping as he practically fell into his chair, laughing all the while. And then, suddenly, all sound in the room simply stopped as Inari walked in. He nodded embarrassedly to his grandfather and mother, both of whom seemed a bit stunned, and took the seat to Sasuke's left. It had been, up until that point, Kakashi's seat, but it seemed their teacher, who was just then walking back into the room, understood that something important must have been going on, and decided to take the seat at the end of the table, next to Naruto, instead. Every eye in the room was on Inari, who fidgeted a little under the scrutiny. Then, after taking a small breath, the black-haired boy looked up at all of them. I'm sorry, you all. The boy bowed his head slightly, and Sasuke didn't think he'd felt this proud since Naruto won his first spar against him. I haven't been, that is. Sasuke put a hand on his shoulder, smiling and nodding approvingly. You don't need to do it all right now, just baby steps. Inari looked relieved, nodding back to him, and then looked towards his mother and grandfather. Tsunami's smile shone, her eyes watering slightly, as she made her way over to her son, embracing him tenderly. You have nothing to apologize for. The boy in her arms hiccuped once, then a second time, then broke down crying, hugging his mother tightly. He pushed his head into the crook of her neck and sobbed. Welp, Kakashi spoke up, eyeing the three of them. I say we get some training in before the sun sets, how about you guys? But Sensei, Naruto spoke up, looking aghast. We haven't eaten. I think that's an excellent idea, Sensei. Sasuke spoke up, standing and giving Kakashi a thankful nod. Yes, that sounds grand. Sakura stood up as well, dragging Naruto by the back of his collar and out of the back door. Kakashi followed behind them, smiling despite the blonde boy's protests, with Sasuke holding up the rear. He looked back in and saw Tozuna trying to meet his eyes. The man gave him a warm smile, bowing slightly, and mouthed thank you. Sasuke smiled back, before walking outside. It wasn't a particularly cold evening, given that it was middle of the summer, but Sasuke still felt himself shivering. It probably didn't help that they were covered from head to toe in water. Kakashi's excuse of training had, apparently, been serious. He told them that now was as good a time as any to practice tree climbing. Unfortunately for their sensei, all three of them, well, he and Sakura, Naruto was having some problems, had been able to manage the technique with very little difficulty. They'd asked for something that was an actual challenge. The man had laughed sadistically, and then told them he had another thing for them to practice. He was going to teach them to water walk. In hindsight, they'd probably had that coming. It had sounded like such a great idea at the time, too. They were surrounded on all sides by water, it made sense to use it. Kakashi had tried really hard to not laugh at them as they'd all fallen in the chilly water. He had also failed, and quite miserably at that, to the point that Naruto had given up on water walking and decided to try and beat up their sensei instead. The man in question had taken the attacks in stride, lecturing him and Sakura while avoiding the blonde's blows. He'd said that it needed to be instinctual, you couldn't will yourself to do it, or that, if you were forcing yourself, then being attacked or having something else take your attention would cause you to sink immediately. It made sense, even if Sasuke had to admit that begrudgingly, given that he was now soaked, as were the rest of Team 7, walking along with him as they tried to dry themselves off with the far too small towels they'd been given. Naruto sneezed, and the sound echoed in the calm night. In the distance, the trees shook lightly with the wind, creating a relaxing ambience for their journey back towards Tsunami's house. Get your gross, sneezy face away from me. Well, it would have been relaxing, if not for his teammates, who continued to argue about anything and everything they could possibly come up with. Who the hell you callin' sneezy? You've been sneezing this entire time. Naruto shot back with an annoyed yell. As if on cue, Sakura herself sneezed into her elbow, shooting the blonde boy an annoyed look as he faked a laugh at her misfortune. Gee guys? Sasuke spoke up, eyes narrowed and teeth chattering as he looked over at the two following him, having fallen behind over the course of their bickering. What? They both responded, turning to face him at the same time. Could we not right now? Both of them grumbled lightly, looking annoyed with him, but decided to finally be quiet, and allow him to get some time to think. His talk with Inari had not, unfortunately, been the ultimate answer to all of the doubts he carried. That was a shame, certainly, but nothing he hadn't expected. He'd only managed to get past his darkness thanks to his friends, along with being given a few years to fully heal. Despite the boy not wanting to hear it, time really was the only cure for what he was going through. It wouldn't erase the pain, not completely, but dull it enough that you could sometimes forget, push it to the back of your mind and move past it. As much as you could, anyways. You'd start to remember the good times more, remember those you lost, and be able to hold them with you as you went forward. At least, that's probably how it is for most people. For him, he could never quite forget about them, those piercing red eyes. Eyes that didn't even see him, but passed him. Towards what, Sasuke didn't know, but he did know what his brother had told him that night, that he had killed his entire family, every single one of them, just to test his strength. No matter how long it took, no matter how large the gap between them, and no matter the friendships he made along the way, there was one thing that stood in Sasuke's heart to this very day. He would kill Itachi. Once upon a time, he might have said whatever it takes as well. He might have been willing to do just as Itachi had done, and killed his best friend for his vengeance. But as he turned around and looked back towards the pair quietly arguing behind him, trying to stop him from hearing them, he couldn't quite stop himself from laughing. I will kill Itachi, Sasuke thought, but I'd never hurt them to do it. And perhaps, to someone so broken as his brother, such a thing would be considered a weakness, something to be abused. Perhaps one day, Sasuke would pay for the bonds he had obtained. As he contemplated this and that, he turned to face forward once more, smothering a laugh as Sakura sneezed directly into Naruto's face as they argued, and noticed that they'd arrived back at Tsunami's. Guys, Sasuke called out, silencing the two people arguing behind him. Let's stop arguing for now, you can pick this up tomorrow. He opened the door with the key they'd been given and stepped inside the small house. There was no sign of Tazuna, Tsunami, or Inari, and for just a second, Sasuke feared the worst. He held up a hand behind him, and instantly all chatter from his teammates ceased. The two could go from casual to business in half a second or less, and he loved that about them. Well, Sakura could. Naruto was still bright orange. His worries were assuaged a few seconds later though, as the trio snuck their way up the stairs, and pushed open the master bedroom door. It was to find Tsunami, Tazuna, and Inari, all cuddled around each other, sleeping soundly. There were tear tracks going down all three of their faces, evidently a much-needed talk had been had. Even still, Sasuke couldn't help the easy smile that came to his face, as he stepped back out of the room and began to make his way back down the stairs. "Ah, that's cute," Naruto said, just a little too loudly, something he tended to do. "Sure, don't ruin it," Sakura chided a second later. They made their way down the stairs a little after Sasuke did, and all three got to work with fully drying themselves off. After they'd done that, and changed into their only spare outfits, which looked suspiciously like all their other outfits, they laid down on their futons, and chatted about the day's events. It was a fairly meaningless talk, definitely not like the one that he and Inari had had upstairs. Kakashi came back around half an hour later, having said that he'd be gathering information at night, and checking on the bridge they'd be watching over. He gave them an extremely basic rundown, before falling into his own futon. He was asleep within a minute. "We should probably follow his lead," Sakura spoke up, smiling at each of them as she lay back, pulling a small blanket around her. He and Naruto followed suit a while later, giggling to themselves over some dumb joke the prankster had made a second before. It was, perhaps, a weakness. All of this, Sasuke knew, could and most likely would be used against him in the future, when he and Itachi finally clashed. Still though, as he looked at Naruto's face, crinkling in laughter and holding a hand over his mouth to smother the noise, he knew what he'd have to do. If Itachi wanted to attack him with the things he cared about the most, then Sasuke knew he'd have to be prepared. He'd need to grow stronger, far stronger than he was right now. He thought of his mother, as warm and caring as a person could be. He thought of his father, rough and stern, but loving in his own way. He thought of his aunt and uncle, always greeting him on his way to school. He thought of all the others who'd been killed just because his brother had been bored. He hadn't failed, he knew that. Even if he had been as strong as his father, it wouldn't have mattered, but he did know one thing. He would never allow that to happen again. He looked towards Kakashi, their leader and mentor, who laughed and joked with the best of them, even with the pain behind his eyes. He looked towards Sakura, their team's heart and soul, sleeping soundly. He looked towards Naruto, on the cusp of sleep, with a residual smile still present on his face. These three, well, more Sakura and Naruto, but Kakashi to a lesser extent, meant the world to him. So, he knew what he had to do. He knew what he'd dedicated all to. Why he'd trained day in and day out. For them, so that when he faced Itachi, that man couldn't hurt any of them. He'd become so much stronger than that man ever would. He'd become more than the rival his brother desired. His fist clenched below the blanket. "I'll protect you all," he whispered quietly. Though apparently not quietly enough, for Naruto rolled over and faced him, looking curiously at him. "You alright, Sasuke?" The boy's eyes were lidded, and he looked like he was already half asleep. "Yeah, I'm just thinking about some stuff." "What kind of stuff?" "Personal stuff." The Uchiha spoke, trying to put an end to this before the boy in front of him could dig any deeper. "Want to tell me about it?" As per usual, however, Naruto wasn't the greatest at picking up on social cues. Or the boy knew just how to read him, as he tended to do. "He's always perceptive when I don't want him to be." Sasuke smiled at the earnest expression on the boy's face, ready to wake himself up and have a conversation that he probably didn't want to have, all so his friend could feel a little better. He sighed, knowing that when Naruto was like this, it was often far better to go along with what the boy wanted. "I was thinking about my brother." The boy opposite him didn't go silent as he might once have, he simply nodded and let Sasuke continue. He told his friend about that night a year or two back, leaving out some parts here or there that he was either too disturbed to think about or too disgusted to remember. He told me that in order to get strong like he had, I'd have to kill my closest friend. That got a reaction from the boy, thought it wasn't the aversion or disgust he expected. Instead, the boy sat up in his futon, now fully engaged in the conversation. Perhaps he understood, without Sasuke having to tell him, that he'd never do such a thing. I never would. I'll grow stronger my own way, but... He was having a hard time finding the words for what he wanted to say, fumbling around a bit. It didn't help that this wasn't a particularly happy topic. Wait a second, Naruto gave him a wicked smile, a teasing expression fit on his face. If you're telling me this, doesn't that mean? The boy scooted over to him. That I'm your closest friend. Color rushed into his cheeks, and he looked away from the boy in front of him, swatting at him with his left hand. It does! Naruto spoke, far too loudly for how late it was. Oh, shut up! I don't know why I tell you these things. Do you hear that, everyone? Naruto leaned back, nearly shouting now. Sasuke Uchiha actually likes me. Alright, fine then. He jumped over and tackled the boy, wrestling with him on the floor. I guess I will kill you after all. Psht, you couldn't kill me, the boy grunted out, pinning Sasuke to the floor as they continued to grapple. Not in a million years. I'm too tough. Yeah. We'll see about that. Guys, what the hell are you doing? Sakura spoke tiredly, sitting up out of her futon and yawning, looking towards them annoyedly. I'm trying to sleep, could you guys not do this right now? Sakura. You won't believe this. Naruto chattered as Sasuke tried desperately to fuse the boy's face with the ground. I'm Sasuke's closest friend. Sakura looked at them both with a deadpan expression, seeming far too tired to have to deal with this crap. I'm going back to sleep. Wake me up again and I'll kill you both. The pink-haired girl laid back down, though Sasuke couldn't tell if she was actually asleep. As their wrestling match winded down, with Sasuke winning, of course, the two settled back into their beddings, pulling their blankets around them. Hey Sasuke? Naruto spoke up, looking over at him from his sleeping bag. Yeah? I just wanted you to know that you're my closest friend too. Curse that dumb boy and his dumb face. Curse his own reddening cheeks and curse his sentimental heart. And I want you to know that no matter what happens, the boy gave him that sun-like smile, which seemed to blot out the dark of the world. I'll trust you with my life. So would I. Sakura spoke up quietly, not facing either of them, but having clearly listened to their conversation. But I might, the darkness inside. Nope, you're my friend. The blonde looked him dead in the eye, as if being his friend was all that mattered in the world. Somehow, Sasuke thought that, come the very end of the world, Naruto would honor that. You're our friend. Sakura chided, looking annoyedly at the blonde-haired boy. And that means you're stuck with us. Sasuke couldn't quite hold in his mirth. He chuckled once, twice, and then devolved into a fit of laughter. He rolled on the floor, even as his two friends giggled to themselves as well, all semblance of quietness gone. After a minute or two of that, he finally tuckered himself out, arms splayed out around him, smiling lightly. Thank you guys. Hey, what are friends for, right? Naruto said, as he rolled back into his futon and shot him a thumbs up. Alright, I'm tired. Night. Oh, so when you want to sleep, the conversation ends, but when it's me, you just keep on going, huh? Sakura scolded, eyes narrowed as she reprimanded the boy for keeping her awake all this time. He let them argue themselves asleep, or, more accurately, he let them argue until Kakashi finally decided to stop feigning sleep and reprimanded them, telling them to go to bed. During that time, he couldn't help but smile peacefully. The day's events were finally getting to him, as he yawned into the back of his hand, snuggling up as best he could with his comically small blanket. He felt just a little warmer than he had yesterday. Sleep hit him a few minutes later. He dreamt of kinder days, his mother and father's faces filling his mind. And for once, no piercing red eyes interrupted. Chapter 7. The first thing Zabuza felt upon waking up was pain, which was fairly surprising, given his tolerance to the stuff. He sat up slowly, making an effort to not aggravate the wound on his abdomen. He failed, of course. He'd never been the most delicate of people, especially not when it came to his own body. Idly, he poked and prodded his bandaged chest, and was rewarded with a dull ache. Those damned kids. He'd forgotten, back then, that even a genin could kill you if you let your guard down. It was one of the first lessons he'd learned, back on the battlefield of the Third Shinobi World War, when his entire squad of Miss Jonin had been wiped out by some prodigy from the Leaf Village. And honestly, he shouldn't even have been going easy on them. One of them had used the Shadow Clone Jutsu, and summoned more clones than most Jonin ever could. And yet, even after seeing that, he just hadn't been able to bring himself to strike them. Because they'd reminded him of Haku. Haku was a weakness, his weakness. Despite it all, though, Zabuza just couldn't bring himself to want to be rid of him. Pragmatically, he knew that the boy was holding him back, had been for several years now. They'd been slower in evacuating the Mist Village, losing more people in their escape, because of him. They'd had to camp more often, the young boy being quickly exhausted, because of him. And even now, Zabuza couldn't strike down a couple of easy targets whose lives were worth more than their weight in gold, because of him. Ostensibly, he kept Haku around to nurture a useful tool. If that tool were only going to get in the way, however, then perhaps he should be rid of it. The sound of quiet, rhythmic breathing shook him out of his own head, and he turned towards the sound of the noise, unconsciously raising his guard. He wouldn't make the mistake he'd made yesterday again. But all he found when he looked beside him was the resting form of his pupil, Haku. The boy was asleep on a small stool that he'd pulled up beside Zabuza's bed, and he was slumped forward, like he'd fallen asleep without meaning to. His eyes widened, and he felt a surge of guilt course through him. Haku had waited for him. He'd gotten him out of harm's way, carried him all the way back here, bandaged and nursed his injuries, and then stayed awake for as long as he could, hoping that he'd wake up. And he'd been thinking about whether or not to throw him out. Without even really thinking about it, Zabuza reached over and lightly shook the boy's shoulder. Haku awoke with a start, gasping lightly. His pupil looked down at him, eyes wide with barely concealed panic, before he saw his face, and sighed in relief. "Mr. Zabuza, you're awake?" His eyes were rife with bags, and his face looked a bit too pale to be considered healthy. Still, the boy's smile seemed to cut into his own heart, rending him before he could so much as say a word. He'd thought about ridding himself of that smile, of this boy. He reached over and placed his hand atop Haku's head, lightly ruffling the boy's hair. His student tensed, and used to such a soft gesture. Despite himself, the boy leaned into it slightly, even as Zabuza pulled his hand away, letting it fall back down at his side. "Thank you, Haku?" He didn't watch at his pupil while he spoke, instead fixating his gaze on a small spot on the ceiling, which he idly noted would probably need repaired soon. As he looked over his student, though, Zabuza noticed that the boy was blushing intensely, looking down at the floor and unable to meet the assassin's own eyes. Something about the whole scene amused the man, and despite not really meaning to, he ended up laughing uproariously. Haku stared at him oddly, a bit confused, even if he was smiling unknowingly. As he calmed down, he looked back over at Haku, looking like the world's most confused puppy dog, and barely managed to keep himself from laughing again. "Gods," Zabuza spoke, still chuckling under his breath, before ruffling the boy's hair one last time. "You're an odd one, brat." He hadn't thought it possible, but somehow the boy managed to look even more confused at that. The boy spoke like he wasn't quite sure what to say, or even if he truly knew what had been said to him. "Thank you, Zabuza, sir?" The kid peered at him quizzically, and then started to examine his head methodically. "What are you doing?" the rogue ninja questioned with no small amount of mirth. "Checking for any head injuries," Haku explained calmly, his face completely serious. "You aren't acting quite like yourself. I just want to make that I didn't miss anything." The assassin couldn't help his laughter that time, and as the boy continued to grow only more and more concerned, it only got worse. When he finally settled down, it was to see his pupil looking at him with eyes that were both worried and bemused. "Sir, are you all right?" He was, at this point, already laughed out, and was able to hear the raw concern in the boy's voice. "I'm fine, Haku," he spoke seriously, with no hint of trickery. "No need to worry so much." The boy seemed to disagree, but otherwise kept silent. Instead, he pulled his stool closer to the foot of the assassin's bed and seemed content to sit there again while Zabuza rested. "Oh no," he began, pointing towards the other bed in the room with his left hand. "Go to sleep." "But sir, I'm fine." "No, you're not, brat." Zabuza looked straight at him, trying to make the boy flinch and look away, which he did a second later. "Tell me honestly, how long were you awake waiting for me to wake up?" The boy knew not to lie to him but had apparently figured out that it still counted as telling him if he mumbled it into his sleeve. "What was that?" Haku looked up at him guiltily, twiddling his thumbs. "26 hours. The man sighed. "Sleep now." The boy seemed ready to protest, looking up at him with one of the first indignant expressions Zabuza thought he'd ever seen on him. "Someone needs to keep watch, Zabuza sir." "I'll be keeping watch, brat." At that, his pupil looked to want to complain again, but he cut him off before he could. "And if anyone does come, I'll wake you up." The boy slumped slightly, and much like a shark that stopped moving for too long, he seemed to lose all of the vigor he'd had a few seconds ago, practically falling into the bed behind him. "All right, sir." The boy gave him a tired smile that looked sloppily plastered onto his face. "I trust you." Zabuza felt a lot like he'd been kicked in the stomach as his student fell asleep mere moments later. "I trust you." He'd actually thought about getting rid of this boy. It hadn't been a serious thought, not one he'd allowed for very long, but he'd certainly considered it for a moment. The only truly good thing he'd ever found, and he'd thought about throwing him away for what? Power? Efficiency? Money? In that moment, as he sat up in his bed, all alone with his thoughts, he recalled when he'd slaughtered hundreds on innocents in his academy exam. He recalled when he murdered comrades for stepping just slightly out of line. He recalled turning on his own kage and burning the village he'd once thought of as a homeland to make his escape. And yet still, it was almost funny. He didn't think he'd ever felt quite this disgusted with himself. He didn't have long to feel sorry for himself, though, as their door was practically broken down a few minutes later. Zabuza made to wake his pupil but found the boy already up and at the ready, looking exhausted but prepared. Their focus didn't even dull upon seeing who walked in. Even if he was their boss at the moment, either of them had any inclinations of trust towards the man. Gato didn't exactly inspire loyalty. "Well, seems you've been getting your ass handed to you." The richest man in the mist stepped into their small abode, flanked by 2 armed guards, who Zabuza noted with some amusement seemed to barely qualify as genin level. His amusement died an ugly death a second later, as Haku made to rise at the man's baiting, a snarl on his face. It was only his own hand on the boy's shoulder that stopped him, and he gave him a curt shake of the head. It wouldn't do for them to anger the man, not with the state they were in. Not as if he could have them killed, he could have sent his entire private army after them, and they would have been able to get away. It was more that they couldn't afford to lose this job on something so asinine as barbed words. They'd already failed once, that much was obvious from their conditions, along with the bridge builder's continued existence. They needed to be calm, focused, prove they could get the job done. Didn't mean Zabuza himself didn't growl a little as the small speck of a man sneered in their direction, and when his pathetic henchmen did the same. "You'd do well to control your pup, Zabuza." He stepped a little closer, dangerously close to Haku, more than close enough for the boy to end the man's life with on no more than a whim, but they all knew he wouldn't. "I don't pay you to fail, but I don't think you'll be paid at all if you're dead." Perhaps the man truly thought he could have them killed if he desired, and the mirth that thought brought was the only thing that kept him from decapitating the man in front of him with his blade. Well, that and his current bout of paralysis. Haku's needles had done a grand job of faking his death, but that also meant they made his muscles seize up a bit. He really did need the rest before he could attack Kakashi's crew again. But Gato couldn't know that, and so he got up, ignoring the sharp pain in his abdomen as he curled into a sitting position, looking the man in the eye with a neutral expression. "I don't tell you how to handle your men, Gato," he spoke calmly, evenly, in as clear a display of strength as he felt he could muster. Do not tell me how to handle mine. Dealing with people like Gato had become something of second nature to Zabuza. He'd been at the mercenary game for a while now, and you didn't get to do that without meeting some unsavory customers, seeking even more unsavory work. Those people wanted to flaunt their power in your face, say without saying that they were the bigger man, and you were a pawn. But if you wanted respect, you had to stand right up with them. Gato had learned a few things about him in their earliest encounters, but easily the most important lesson he'd been taught was that Zabuza wasn't to be trifled with. And that was crucial, because now, even when he was at his very weakest, in an easy position for Gato to perhaps sell his location to those Leaf Ninja, he didn't dare make a move against him. The man knew to fear him, but also knew, via reputation, that the assassin got the job done. He'd give him a second chance. Both of them already knew that. This whole thing, the taunting, the baiting, was just this pathetic man trying to make himself feel a little bigger, make himself feel powerful against someone he would normally never be able to contest. It was just ceremony, so that he could look good in front of his men. Zabuza himself was content to allow it, mostly because the man paid well. It certainly made it easier to cope with the man practically spitting in his face. Haku was struggling a bit though. That'd be because my men are well trained. Gato smirked maliciously, walking over to his pupil and standing at his full height, which was probably less than a meter. His men behind him were the only thing that kept him from looking like a joke, and even then it was only just. They aren't animals I picked up off the street. Deep breaths, Zabuza had to remind himself. He'll be gone in a minute, and you can do your job. Still, best to accelerate this little farce, rather than risk his, or Haku's anger, getting to them. Why are you here, Gato? He kept his voice as collected as he could manage, which was difficult as his left hand continued to push Haku back into his bed, preventing him from standing and making a scene. If you're worried about us leading the job, don't be, we'll attack again in a day or two. The man seemed to think as hard as he could, which Zabuza reckoned wasn't particularly hard at all, and concluded that he wasn't being lied to. He harumphed loudly, probably annoyed that he couldn't feel all big and strong today, and stepped back towards the exit. 1 to 2 days, correct? Gato turned one last time, eyes squinted as he looked at the two of them. We'll get it done. The man stepped outside, his guards following him a few seconds later, though not without shooting them one final barb. Do not fail me again. I have more than enough resources to bury the both of you. Gato's men slammed the door behind them, cracking the frame a bit. Silence fell upon the two of them, and Zabuza realized a second or two later that he was still pushing his pupil into his bed, trying to keep him from lashing out. He removed his hand, still reeling a bit from how he thought about the boy earlier. Sir, why do we have to deal with people like that? Haku's voice surprised him, and he turned to see the boy gazing at the floor, eyes hard with anger. We do it because we need to, Haku, Zabuza said, laying back down, making the pain in his abdomen finally dull. If we're ever going to kill the Mizukage. Why do we need to do that? His eyes widened as he stared at his student. He'd never heard him shout like that before, nor had he ever heard the boy question his decisions. Haku seemed to come to his senses a second later, and his eyes dulled from their previous state. I'm sorry, Zabuza sir, I shouldn't be thinking about these things. It's fine, Haku, but what? I seem to be feeling faint, sir, my apologies. Haku laid down on his bed, turning away from him, shrouding his face from view. The boy had never been dismissive before, never acted like this before, and he honestly couldn't see why he would all of a sudden. Still, he was exhausted himself, and dealing with Haku's new mood wasn't helping at all. He resigned to deal with this when the boy woke up. Upon hearing the boy's breathing become more rhythmic, he sat back into his headboard, not laying down. He didn't trust himself to do that with how tired he was, but simply laying back against it. He waited a while, fiddling with this and that. Watching for intruders was never a particularly grand thing, unless, of course, you actually got attacked. It was for that reason that it was important, but it still didn't help him now. The only threat he thought they might face had come and gone. Even still though, as he sat silently, Thinking about what Haku had said, and what he was going to do about it, he felt himself grow more and more tired. By the time the boy awoke, he was far too exhausted to bring the boy's outburst back up. He let him take over the watch and laid down. The only sleep that came was fitful. "I'm sorry," Kakashi-sensei seemed, frankly, flabbergasted at what Naruto had just said. "You did what?" "I said I used my shadow clones to train with tree climbing." Naruto looked inordinately proud of himself, smiling brightly. "Sasuke thought that I should be more strategic with my clones, think more about when to use them, and how to use them, so I remembered that when the clones die, I get, like... Sasuke, what's the word for? Feedback." The boy sighed out. "Right, feedback. Anyways, I get feedback when they die, and learn stuff." Naruto looked around at the three of them, checking to make sure they were listening. "And most of the time I just learned what it feels like to get stabbed with a sword or something." All of Team 7 grimaced slightly. "But it did give me this super cool idea." Sakura herself was interested. After all, the boy had been off in the woods doing God knows what for 3 or 4 days now. She was curious to find out what that was all about. "I made like 30 or 40 shadow clones and had them all practice the tree climbing stuff. It was super weird, and I got really tired after doing it." Naruto spoke into the ground, but then smiled widely, looking back up at all of them with a cocky expression. "But I learned how to climb the trees with my chakra." Sakura thought that sounded incredibly useful, and extremely overpowered, but decided not to comment about it. She gazed over at Sasuke and found the boy wearing the same mildly interested expression she was. On the other hand, their sensei looked like he was about to have a heart attack. "Naruto," Kakashi spoke with a feigned sense of calm, holding his hands over his mouth in a reverent gesture. "After you finished, and banished all of your shadow clones, how did you feel?" Naruto looked inquisitive, scratching the bottom of his chin, before he responded, "I don't know." "What do you mean?" "I mean, I kind of passed out afterwards, so I don't really remember." Their teacher took a deep breath, exhaling forcefully. "That would be because what you did should have killed you," Kakashi practically yelled, exasperated as he panted for breath. Sakura felt some of that herself, upon hearing that their friend probably should have died, all from just a small experiment. "How the hell did you even get your hands on the shadow clone jutsu anyways?" "It's locked away in the scroll of ceilings." The two boys in front of her both coughed, their eyes trying desperately to find anything in the room that wasn't their sensei. The man simply sighed. "Alright, I'm going to pretend I didn't ask that question, and move on to the topic at hand." Naruto and Sasuke both sent the man grateful nods, blushing profusely. "Today we'll be officially commencing our continuous mission of guarding Tazuna on the bridge." That had Sakura's attention, and that of the other two boys as well. They turned towards their teacher, eyes hardening as they thought of what they may face. "We'll be doing this on a rotating schedule." Kakashi turned to her first. "Sakura, you'll be watching the bridge with me today, then." He turned towards their resident blonde. "Naruto will be with me the next day," finishing off with Sasuke. "We'll then repeat this schedule, every day, until the bridge is completed, and trade between the wave and the leaf is finalized, or until the ninja threat this country is facing is dealt with." He looked each one of them in the eye and then, seeming confident in what he saw there, walked towards the doorway, Sakura just a few measures behind him. "All right." The man stepped outside. "Let's do this." Guarding a bridge was, in Naruto's opinion, the most boring thing in the entire world. I mean, he'd done a few D-ranked missions that were more boring, like dog walking and cat catching, but those were at worst a few hours long. He'd been watching this bridge for 8 hours now, and according to Kakashi, it was going to be another 3 or 4 before the workers went home. Perhaps this is what hell is like, Naruto thought, gently stroking his chin, eyes squinting in contemplation. He had to admit that, as the mist started to roll in, and Kakashi grabbed his shoulder, telling him to be ready for a fight, he was almost glad. Okay, he was extremely glad. Fighting was way more fun than waiting. Kakashi had filled him and the rest of Team 7 in a few days ago. In the most likely case, Zabuza was alive, and that seeker ninja they'd encountered was helping him. If the two came after the bridge, Naruto was to send a shadow clone to alert the two still at tsunamis to send one person for backup. He did just that, making the shadow clone sign and summoning a second copy of himself. The other him nodded, and dashed off of the bridge, making his way into the winding streets of the wave. As he turned around, ready to face combat, it was to see his teacher already exposing his Sharingan. He didn't want his sensei to put himself at risk with it, but he also knew that, until Kakashi had brought it out, he had struggled against the man they now faced. Naruto prepared for the battle his own way, summoning 10 shadow clones beside him, and had 3 of them run straight into the oncoming mist. Ah, okay, so that's what dying via 1,000 needles to the face feels like, Naruto thought, wincing. Good to know. Oh, and death via giant sword again, awesome. Yeah, it's them. Naruto spoke glumly, holding up his kunai in front of him, prepared to deflect any projectiles that may be thrown at him. That was smart thinking, Naruto. Kakashi spoke, looking at him with an oddly proud expression, like the man hadn't thought he'd think of that. Yeah, thanks. The blonde spoke awkwardly, looking back at the mist rolling in with a small blush on his face. It felt good to be smart, to think of things no one else did, and to have someone point it out to you. Whenever he managed to pull a trick on Sasuke in one of their spars that had the other boy reeling, he always felt so happy afterwards. Even when he lost, it felt good to come closer and closer. It still felt frustrating as all hell to lose, but he'd gotten used to that honestly. The whining and screaming about it were purely for aesthetic purposes. A small needle, almost indistinguishable from the mist it emerged from, whizzed towards him, and he realized with terror that he wouldn't be able to block it in time. Kakashi batted it aside with the back of his glove, eyes never leaving the encroaching fog. Focus, Naruto. Why yeah, will do, sensei. Their opponents finally showed themselves a second later. Zabuza looked exactly the same, though his eyes held a certain expression to them that hadn't been there last time, and Naruto honestly wasn't sure what to make of it. It wasn't unfamiliar to him. He'd seen it quite a few times in Sasuke before. It was doubt. Whatever that was about, however, Naruto didn't know. He couldn't tell if that'd be good or bad for them. The man could all of a sudden be doubting whether or not he should just kill them this time, instead of dancing around them for 20 minutes. If that was the case, then he hoped the man in front of them resolved his issues in a timely manner. Kakashi. Zabuza spoke loudly and confidently, almost snarling the name out as he gripped his sword and brought it down upon the bridge below them, cracking it apart at his feet. I'll offer one last time, give up that man, and you'll all get to leave here alive. His teacher gave a small chuckle, drawing a small scroll from within his vest and bringing it forth, eyes hardening as he took a battle-ready stance. I'm afraid that won't be possible. The assassin in front of them merely nodded, having already accepted this outcome before he arrived. He pulled his sword up onto his shoulder, gave a quick command to the masked guy, and charged at them. A second later, the masked man was on him, and Naruto had to deflect the guy's initial assault with his kunai, letting the momentum of the hit knock him backwards. He spun to a stop a meter or so back, eyeing the man in front of him. Okay, Sasuke says step 1 is to analyze my opponent. A Saban licked the side of his face, cutting a small incision into his cheek. He paled slightly, just managing to dodge the second one on instinct, before taking a third directly into his shoulder. Compared to a shuriken, which he'd taken a few of to the chest in his spars with Sasuke, it wasn't anything to mention, but that was like saying a jonin was nothing in the face of a kage. Technically true, but missing the point, it hurt like hell. Still, he didn't scream or cry, he merely hissed in pain. Now that he was fully focused on the fight, he was able to dodge the next few needles with ease, and even match the man's own kunai with one of his own, knocking both out of the air. It would have been generous to call it a stalemate though. He had been losing ground the entire fight so far, and if Sasuke's words were true, which they tended to be, then first impressions in a fight were generally correct, unless the other party had something to shake it up. Naruto did have something to shake things up, though. He brought out his hands, forming his signature shadow clone sign, and grinned as 20 or so copies of himself burst into existence beside him. They charged at the masked man in front of him with reckless abandon, kunai at the ready. His plan encountered problems almost immediately. As it turned out, clones that vanished upon being struck were fairly susceptible to needles, which, while not doing very much damage, were very good at causing slight amounts of pain. The masked man in front of him threw a single samban for each of his charging clones, killing all of them, and barely breaking a sweat. That would, normally, have been a problem, and a large one at that. But Naruto couldn't help the relieved smile that blossomed onto his face, and the man in front of him must have seen it, because he hesitated. The man didn't notice it, and really, he couldn't be blamed for that. Couldn't be blamed for the kunai now sticking out of his back either. Sasuke landed beside him with a roll, smiling up at him. Took you long enough. Naruto spoke with a smirk. Hey, you're the one who took so long, that clone was barely trying. Sasuke tried to sound mad, but seemed unable to manage it, instead focusing in on the opponent in front of them, now wounded. The masked man laughed. Which, to Naruto at least, meant that something was about to make their situation considerably worse. It came in the form of several, meter or so tall ice mirrors, which began to form around them in a dome-like shape. Sasuke made to attack the man in front of them and stop them from forming, but he dove backwards, literally sinking into the reflective surface. Secret technique, demonic mirroring ice crystals. The man's reflection walked forwards, though never quite stepping out of the mirror in front of him. Naruto had a vague sense that he'd heard the voice before but dismissed it. It wouldn't do to dwell on meaningless thoughts during a battle. Not when their enemy was pelting them with samban, all from nearly complete safety. I'd like to retract my previous statement, Naruto thought, yelping in pain as 100 or more needles stuck into his flesh. These hurt way more than a shuriken. He's aiming for pressure points, Naruto. Sasuke hissed out between grit teeth, himself bearing several needles. He seemed to be better at batting the needles out of the sky, though, because the floor in front of the boy was littered with the things. Cover your face with your arms, but if you can, deflect them. He wanted to make some comment about that, but honestly couldn't find the energy. It turned out that feeling pain all over your body, extreme, lingering pain, kind of killed one's ability to make jokes. Fire style, fireball jutsu. Sasuke's flames lit up the fog surrounding them, glowing brightly as it burned against the series of mirrors in front of them. Unfortunately, while he sat and channeled it, several samban embedded themselves into his back. The boy stumbled slightly, but didn't relent in his attack, continuing to blast away at the ice sheets that blocked their escape. When the flames faded, there wasn't a single nick on the ice. What? Naruto breathed out, disbelief, panic, and hopelessness filling his voice. What the hell do we do, Sasuke? Calm down, Sasuke yelled, looking over at him and wincing from the movement, as several of the kunai in his back popped out. Naruto caught him as he staggered slightly, looking around for Zabuza's partner. We need to think, his best friend looked up at him, analyzing the situation. Can you use your shadow clones, and get a few of them out of this, try and break it from the outside? Tried already, the needles get rid of them instantly. As if on cue, another round of the senbons rained down on them, and Naruto shielded his friend from them, even as a few hundred of the things impacted his back. It was his turn to nearly fall, and be held up by his friend, who had recovered enough to stand solidly. These things don't do much damage, but they wear us down. The boy looked around, eyeing for anything that would get them out of their predicament. Naruto, do you have any ideas? And no. He was panicking now, he knew that. It was hard not to, honestly. He spawned as many shadow clones as he felt he could muster, and had each and every one of them charge towards the icy walls, trying to hit them. Every single one of them was cut down. Another round of Saban, more wounds on his body. He wasn't all there anymore. He could tell, because he was honestly considering just screaming and falling into a ball on the ground. Really, what damage would that do? None, right? Maybe it was just better to give up. A second later, something big whizzed by them, and Naruto felt the first extreme pain of the fight so far. He yelled loudly as something tore a chunk out of his shoulder. What the hell was that? Naruto screamed out, looking all around for whatever had just struck them. That boy! Sasuke shouted, eyes moving a mile a minute as he scanned their surroundings, desperately searching for the masked man they were fighting. His answer came a second later, however, as Naruto vaguely made out a human-like shape blur past his friend and shouted the boy's name as blood pooled onto his shoulder. A kunai was embedded into it. Sasuke coughed, looking around, before, to Naruto's immense surprise, he smiled. I could see him. What? I could follow him, with my eyes. His friend was panting, but there was no denying the rush of hope they both felt. If they could track the masked man, then maybe they could start fighting back against him. I have a plan, Naruto, but it's not a great one. I'll take anything at this point. I'm going to hit him with a kunai at the exact moment he emerges. Naruto felt like that was, perhaps, a pretty terrible plan, but couldn't bring himself to say it. Alright, what do you need me to do? Look for any patterns. Sasuke spoke, voice becoming calculating, eyes scanning for anything and everything. How often does he charge at us? How many mirrors does he cross before he charges us? Can he move freely between mirrors without penalty? Does he always move at the same speed? Stuff like that, just little things. It's small but... I got it. Naruto spoke, nodding to the boy in front of him. You can count on me. Sasuke gave him a small smile, then placed his back to Naruto's, so that the two of them faced opposite sides of the icy wall. He's coming! Sasuke shouted, and that was the only warning Naruto got before a sharp pain impacted the back of his left shoulder, just a scant few inches from his neck. Analyze. Think. It took him 2 seconds for. The masked man charged, and Naruto just barely managed to deflect the kunai in his hand, but he couldn't stop the man from sailing away, back into a mirror opposite them. Wait. That could be something. I think I have something. Really? Yeah, try not to sound so shocked. Naruto shouted, but he couldn't help more hope resurfacing. I've got to be sure, first though, gimme one more run. Got you. As the man came in for another blow, Naruto anticipated the man's movements. He was rewarded by a sharp gasp, as he drew a faint line on the masked man's arm. It wasn't a particularly large cut, perhaps slightly deeper than one would get from a piece of paper. To him, in that moment, it might as well have been the killing blow. I've got it. He can only attack in a straight line, and only from his right side. Dodge to the left, and then slash, you'll hit him every time. That was awesome, Naruto. It was such a small sound, really. It was a whistling noise that started small, yet in an instant seemed to blot out all the sound in the world. The man was coming again. Naruto could see it. Sasuke had turned towards him, eyes filled with joy and mirth and hope and pride and a million other little things. He looked away from his opponent, just for a second, and now he was going to pay. He couldn't tell where the kunai was aimed, but he didn't have the time to figure it out either. Naruto knew there could be no hesitation, no interim moment if he was going to save his friend. Without really thinking, he moved. Blood dribbled down his chin. The kunai in their opponent's hands shook, though the weapon didn't move. It rattled, sure, but it was too deep in to come loose so easily. Too deep into his own left breast. Cutting into Naruto's heart. Sasuke! He shouted with every bit of energy he still had, every last fiber of his being as he grabbed the masked man's hand, holding him in place, even as he struggled to break free. Naruto felt that, normally, the man would have been able to pull away with ease. He seemed so much stronger than him. Perhaps it was ironic that now of all times, he felt truly strong. Now! His best friend didn't waste his chance, digging a kunai out of his shoulder and stabbing it directly into the masked man's chest. Their opponent screamed, finally managing to break free of Naruto's hold as he pulled away, inadvertently taking Naruto with him. He felt his body falling forward, unable to hold himself up. Sasuke's arms caught him. They felt so warm against him, and Naruto felt himself lean into the boy without meaning to. And Naruto? He looked up at his friend, wondering what he wanted. A hot, salty droplet impacted his cheek a second later, rolling its way down his face. Sasuke was crying openly, his face a complete mess of blood and tears. The boy looked so foreign to him. He had never seen him in so terrible a state. Idly, he pulled a samban out of his shoulder, just to see what would happen. He didn't even feel it. He thought he vaguely remembered Irika-sensei telling them that that was a bad sign. Oh! Naruto realized, eyes glazing over as he looked straight into the sky. I'm going to die. Naruto, come on, man! Sasuke was crying, trying to haul him to his feet, but the boy was just too weak from the fight. You've gotta get up. He felt weak himself. He tried to follow his friend's commands, tried to move a muscle, but found his own body unresponsive. It was so odd to feel like you didn't belong in your own body, like you weren't even really in it at all. 1.5 million thoughts crossed his mind. He saw his life in the village, the children he used to play with, their parents taking them away. The shopping district, being chided, bullied, beaten, screaming about becoming the Hokage, a fox, and needing Sasuke. He saw Sakura, and Ino, and Irika. He saw dumb pranks and even dumber kids, just trying to have as much fun as they could. He looked at himself, laughing and messing around with Sasuke as he finished painting the mustache onto the 4th Hokage's monument. What? What about becoming Hokage, huh? Sasuke's tears were falling down onto his face, trickling down his own chin. You need to get up if you want to be Hokage, Naruto, so come on. Damn, Naruto thought, smiling bitterly, I feel like an idiot. He'd never amount to anything in his life. He'd known that from the very beginning, since it all started. Everyone in the entire village had told him that, time and time again. Perhaps, somewhere along the line, he'd grown to believe them. I was never going to be Hokage. If it was possible for Sasuke's face to grow more shocked, more devastated than it did. The boy's eyes widened, and his eyebrows drew even higher. He felt bad, he wanted to take back the words he'd said. Gods, I want to do so many things differently. Hey Sasuke? He noted idly that his voice was weaker than he meant it to be, coming out as barely a whisper. See, can you promise me something? Anything. He smiled, and the weight on his shoulders seemed to disappear. He noted, with some semblance of surprise, that the wound on his chest didn't hurt quite so much, but he'd chalked that up to his nerves shutting down. I want you to make your dream come true. He grasped the boy's hand in his own, vaguely surprised at how feeble his own grip felt compared to his friend's. Grow stronger than your brother, beat him. Be but your dream, being Hokage. His vision was filling with black. Sasuke resided in a small portrait, just in the center of it all. Naruto noted with some idle curiosity that the boy's eyes were a sparkling red, with 3 small, black dots swirling within them. His Sharingan matched Kakashi's perfectly. See, can't do that. Now. He felt all the pain fade, felt his vision go black. He was dying. Maybe you could. And with one final breath, Naruto Uzumaki expired in the cold. Or wake up. Or, Naruto remarked, as he gasped and sat up, finding strength in his arms and legs more than capable of keeping him upright, perhaps not. Upright in a few inches of water? Where the hell? Look over here, you idiot, you don't have long. He did as was asked of him, and found. Naruto screamed, and quite loudly at that. A giant, reddish-brown fox lay behind giant, rusted steel bars. The beast had red, slitted eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness of the room, and 9 tails that flowed behind him like a river. The whole thing seemed far too big to be conceivably created, and yet Naruto could feel that he wasn't dreaming. He honestly wasn't sure how he knew. It would have made far more sense if this was a dream, some kind of near-death hallucination. But it wasn't. Something in his stomach, the black swirl he'd seen only a few times in his life, told him it wasn't. He screamed again, just for good measure. Shut up. He did as commanded, feeling like he could be forgiven for listening to a giant, 9-tailed fox demon. Wait a second. You're the fox from my nightmares. Really? That's what you focus on. The fox actually shook his head, which seemed an oddly human thing to do, before he looked back at him. Ugh, never mind. Listen, boy, the fox placed his head upon the floor of the room, creating a small wave of water that rose about halfway to Naruto's knees. "You're dying." What was he supposed to say to that? "I know. I will save you." 4 words, 4 very simple words, and yet they carried with them a strange power. With them, Naruto felt hope blossom up into his chest, and some of the lingering pain he felt seemed to disappear. "Why would you do that?" "Because you and I, boy, are connected. You go, I go." The fox pointed to each of them in turn, his smile becoming sinister. "Well, I'd reform after a while, but honestly, that sounds like such a trifle. So, I'm cutting you a good deal, you get to live." That did sound like a good deal. Sasuke's advice came back to him, that if a deal seemed too good, that was often because it was. "What's in it for you?" The fox actually laughed. "You seem to think you have a choice in the matter." Naruto felt power, overwhelming amounts of it, course through him, as the water below him became a faint orange in color, and the surface began to bubble ominously. "Luckily for me, you're close enough to death that your body's natural desire to live is overriding any will you might have had. I can pour in as much chakra as your body needs to live before it stops taking it." So, the fox remarked ominously, poking his claw out of the cage, and bringing it to a stop just before Naruto's forehead. Up close, the beast's claw was massive, perhaps the size of him on its own. "I get to, let's say, accelerate my plan a bit." "Oh good," Naruto thought, feeling fear course through him. "I was worried you just helped me to be nice." "So, get back out there, kid." The fox turned one last time, and laid down in his cage, his massive red eye seeming to pierce through Naruto's very soul as it shut slowly. "Oh, and do be careful out there." Sasuke was still losing, and the thought filled him with a vitriol hate. His eyes were runny with horrid, messy tears. Even as his vision seemed to get better and better with each passing second, he felt his eyes blur as well. He couldn't focus, not with what had happened. Naruto was dead, and it was his fault. He'd lost focus, looked towards the boy out of pride. He'd watched the look on the boy's face go from happy, to shocked, to determined. He had been completely sure of himself. He'd just thrown his life away, at the drop of a hat, and for what? For him. He just wanted to scream, he wanted to kill everything in his way right now. He watched in slow motion as the man popped out of the mirror, nursing his abdomen where Sasuke himself had stabbed him, and threw a few sabon at him. He deflected them, easily, effortlessly. His eyes were too good. They didn't even linger on the needles, seeming to almost target them for his hand to follow up. It felt like they'd been locked onto. The boy himself, however, was just a bit more agile. Even as Sasuke followed Naruto's advice, dodging to the left and slashing out at the mask on his face, scoring a deep line, he found himself unable to go further as a small, icy dagger nearly cut his arm clean off. He dodged at the last second, feeling rage fill him. He felt his eyes heighten again, see even slower. He felt like he could see each individual piece of ice that fell off the mirrors around him. He had nearly an eternity to himself before the boy attacked again, even if it was only 4 seconds later. He noted that there were exactly 476 Sanban on the ground, and 53 still in his body. He noted Naruto's body move. He noted Naruto's body move. He noted Naruto's body move. It was subtle, really, just a small shaking in the boy's right hand, but it was still movement. Movement that was impossible. Should have been impossible. Unless Naruto was alive, of course. Joy and hope surged through him. If he could beat the ninja in front of him, could defeat him and make it to Kakashi, then maybe he could still save his. A roaring sound, a noise that Sasuke didn't think could have been created by anything human, seemed to rip the air apart. The masked assailant, who had been about to attack him once more, stopped in his tracks. No, he hadn't stopped. He'd been blown backwards from the force of the roar itself. It had had substance to it, pushing the very fog around them away. It had buffeted him back a few inches, even with his stance. Naruto rose. Sasuke nearly wept again, rushing over to his friend, completely forgetting about the battle before them. And then Naruto fell onto all fours, his mouth curling into a snarl. The thing looked up at him, its eyes red with hatred, unnatural slits running down the middles, the chakra around it bubbling to the surface in an orange layer that seemed to surround Naruto's whole body, coalescing into a single, orange tail that flowed behind him. Its gaze pierced him, staring into his very core. Sasuke saw no recognition in its eyes. And Naruto? The creature charged.